Let's talk to Ron Unz. He's the publisher of the American Conservative magazine, joining us live there in the States. So, lots to discuss concerning strategics and economics. Let's talk about strategy first. China's not held back in opposing US foreign policy recently, both on North Korea and Syria. Will Hillary Clinton try and get the Chinese to give some ground on these issues, or is that a lost cause?
Well, that certainly seems plausible, and that certainly would be one of her aims. It's not clear to me whether the Chinese will make those sorts of concessions, given their very strong economic position right now and the vast amount of dependence America has in selling its debt to the Chinese.
Yes, talking about that debt, something like $1 trillion of US public debt there in China. Can the US really be in any way confrontational or put pressure on China, bearing that aspect in mind?
Well, from a rational point of view, America is obviously in a weak position for that reason. But a lot of American leaders seem to not recognize those realities and are still thinking that America is in the position it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, the enormously dominant world superpower. And that just is not the case anymore. And I don't know whether American leaders recognize that.
Yeah, talking about superpower and geopolitics, America recently held Navy drills with the Philippines. There's marine deployment in Australia. Obama's clearly saying that all eyes are now on Asia-Pacific. How is China going to play this? Certainly by what appears with Washington slowly encircling Chinese territory.
Obviously, the Chinese are not very happy at those developments, and I think to some extent America's actions are much more provocative than they might be. But from another perspective, the Chinese economy is growing at an enormous pace, and the American economy is not. So it's perfectly rational for the Chinese leaders to, in effect, accept these pinpricks on America's side and just realize that in another 5 or 10 years, the Chinese position will be enormously stronger relative to America than it is today.
But isn't the Chinese economy very reliant on the US economy, despite being stronger, though?
That's not entirely clear. In other words, they're reliant on us to the extent that they lend us a lot of money and send us their goods in return for pieces of paper. The point is the Chinese are actually moving themselves much more towards a domestic consumer development economy. They're talking about building, I believe, 35 million new public housing apartments in the next few years. They're really doing a lot of internal development as well. So in a few years down the road, if America is not buying many Chinese goods and can't afford to buy as many Chinese goods, that may not matter as much to China as it does today. China's greatest dependency is obviously on natural resources, oil from the Middle East, a lot of other resources from Australia, Brazil, countries like that. And I think those countries are probably more important to China down the road than America is.
Ron, I mentioned elephant in the room during these discussions, particularly when it comes to human rights. Obviously, attention is paid very much by the US on human rights issues in China. Do you think Clinton will put them on the agenda, especially in the light of what we've been hearing about the blind dissident who escaped house arrest and fled to the US embassy?
I certainly think she might take that position. Again, partly because a lot of American leaders, I don't think, recognize many of the activities that the American government has taken, and many of what might be called the severe human rights abuses that America has taken against people over the last few years around the world. In other words, I think there's partly a case of American leaders believing their own propaganda, believing what they read in the Wall Street Journal, believing what they read in the New York Times, and not recognizing as much that much of that reporting is very heavily slanted. It's a little bit like the old problem that the Soviet leaders used to have 25 or 30 years ago, that they many times believed what they read in Pravda, and Pravda was their own propaganda organ.
Okay, Ron, just very briefly, people describe relations quite delicate between the two. How would you sum up the future prospects of China and US relations? Just very briefly, please.
I think the relations certainly could be very good down the road. I mean, in other words, we produce many things that they need, they produce many things that we need, but we have to recognize it's a two-way street, and we can't set the rules on everything ourselves.
Ron, great to hear you. Thank you very much for your time. Ron Unz, publisher of the American Conservative magazine, there live in the States.